Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Noah Gordon, and I'm acting co-director of Carnegie's new Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics Program. Thanks so much for joining us today for a discussion on climate migration and Jake Bittle's great new book, The Great Displacement. But before we get to Jake, I wanted to introduce another expert on climate change impacts. Next to me on screen is Sarah Labowitz, a new non-resident scholar in our program. Sarah's work lies at the intersection of climate, national security, and democracy. She's previously worked in leadership roles at the ACLU of Texas and the City of Houston's Housing and Community Development Department. And before that, she was a policy advisor at the U.S. State Department. Sarah, welcome to Carnegie. Can you tell us about the main project you're working on right now?
Yeah, so I'm wrapping up a documentary film project that'll come out later this year called Texas USA, which looks at how progressive organizers and candidates in Texas are confronting the state's right-wing leadership.
Very cool. I look forward to that. You're also writing an essay for us that gets at the issue of climate-related disasters. Can you tell us about your main arguments in that forthcoming piece?
Yeah, and I spent the weekend reading Jake's terrific book, and it just intersects so much with what he's, I'm sure, going to talk about. But it's really about how the impacts of climate affect our national security, and we should address them as a policy issue. It's informed by my experience working on disaster recovery after Hurricane Harvey, which was a really significant rain and flooding event here in Houston in 2017. And it identifies several risks that we should be considering from a national security perspective, and then ends with a message of or some signs of hope around the kind of organizing that happens after disaster. Multiracial coalitions come together to make practical demands of the government, and so I'm really interested in that as we think about how we confront the sort of democracy downward spiral in the country right now.
And as a final question to connect us back to Jake's book, can you tell me a little bit about the connection in Houston between climate change, homelessness, and migration after Harvey, and maybe something that jumped out to you from Jake's chapter on Houston?
Yeah, I mean, it was really moving, I think, to read about the place where I live. I've lived here since 2017, and I spent a very formative chapter of my career working for the city in the housing department. So the themes that are in Jake's book about housing, it's really a book about housing and where people live and the kind of visceral nature of those decisions, and then how it connects to the decisions that government makes at the local, state, federal level. And, something that stood out for me is I was in the housing department, which is the HUD-funded disaster programs. A lot of what Jake talks about in the book is focused on the FEMA and the immediate response. And so there's so much that from a policy perspective, from a funding perspective, that I think is worthy of attention from a national security and a policymaking perspective in the book. And I think one of my favorite lines in the book early in it was he describes a character named Dale, and he says, like many people who have influenced the course of history, Dale was just doing his job. And that was so much my experience of the kind of butterfly effect of all these decisions of people who are, in a program implementation mode. And there's really such a profound need to address these issues from a bigger picture policy perspective. And so that's why I'm excited to be joining the program and excited for the conversation with Jake.
Yeah, we're excited too. Thanks so much, Sarah. We'll keep an eye out for your essay, and we'll bring in Jake now. Thank you. So joining me on screen now is Jake Bittle, a staff writer at the climate publication Grist and the author of The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration. Just a note on the program, I'll talk with Jake for about 25 minutes before we open up for audience questions. But you can put your questions in the YouTube chat whenever, and feel free to put your name and affiliation so I can shout you out. We've got a big crowd today, so I want to leave about 15 minutes for that. Jake, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Sarah, as well, for that very illuminating introduction.
I think today's an appropriate day to have this event on climate migration because today also brought the release of the latest summary of climate science from the IPCC. The world's top climate scientists say we're likely to pass 1.5 degrees of warming by the early 2030s, and they say with high confidence that climate change is increasingly driving displacement in Africa, Asia, and North America because of extreme heat, climate-related diseases, extreme weather such as flooding, and that these impacts are going to get worse. So that's a scientific foundation for our discussion today. Jake, I'll start you with a big picture question. Like the IPCC, you intentionally used the word climate displacement rather than migration. Why displacement?
Yeah, I think that for most people, the word migration has a few connotations, right? It implies a voluntary movement from point A to point B, where in many cases there's a specific destination in mind, and it usually happens, one time. There's a beginning and an ending, and I mean, when I started to, that is certainly a kind of movement that is going to be caused by climate change all over the world. But when I started to look into what was happening in the United States, it became clear that the aggregate movement was quite a bit different from that type of migration. In many cases, people, they didn't want to leave where they were from, and they were trying their best to stay where they were, but they were involuntarily displaced to a different place. The other side of it was that a lot of times these movements were they were perceived to be temporary. They happened multiple times, and there was no clear end point in mind. So people would move multiple times. They would move to a place and then move back to where they were from. They would sort of move back and then they would leave again. And it was, I think I said in the book that it's less like, an arrow rushing toward a target. It's more like a pot that starts to boil and it sort of just churns around. And that was the movement that I was perceiving in those places. It's just sort of, it's really, really chaotic. And a lot of the people who are caught up in it don't really perceive themselves as being migrants or refugees, which is how they're often described in policy literature and the popular press. So I wanted to use that word, which is pretty much ubiquitous in discussing housing policy, to sort of try to reframe the conversations about what is going to happen when climate change knocks people out of their homes.
Got it. No, it's really interesting. I'm always interested in the origin stories of books like this because at Grist, you've covered everything from European fossil fuel subsidies, the drought in the American West, to Biden's decision to approve the Willow Oil project last week. How did you choose this topic for your first book?
Yeah, so I was toward the end of 2019, I went to Houston actually to work on an article for a different magazine about this home buyout program where the federal government would give the county money to basically knock down some homes in parts of the city that were perennially prone to flooding. And the reason I went there was to examine these miniature ghost towns that had kind of started to appear within the rather dense urban fabric of Houston. But while there, talking to the few holdouts who were left in these places and just sort of examining how strange it was that there were these pockets of emptiness, I started to think where did everyone go who took this money and left their homes behind to be destroyed? And nobody, literally almost nobody could tell me anything about what had happened. FEMA's database of buyout participants was miserable. It was completely broken and incomplete. And the county and the city had done almost no work to track what had happened. And there was maybe one academic study about this. So that was where I started, was we're doing this kind of uncontrolled sort of accidental experiment in letting people move away or in incentivizing them to move away from vulnerable places. But we don't know what works and what doesn't work about it. And we don't really know how people fare once they leave behind the most vulnerable places and try to find their way to safe shelter elsewhere. So that was the genesis of the project. And it quickly became clear to me that, even beyond the floodplain home buyout program, there were many kinds of displacement happening. And there were many places where after these disasters, thousands of people would find themselves without homes and would make their way to other places. And in almost no cases was there sustained attention on the long-term process of relocation after disasters. So that's what I wanted to do. And when I wrote the story, I ended up with something like 20 times the amount of material that my editor was willing to allow me to use. Which was totally defensible. But I sort of thought, okay, I'll take this and try to do something else with it.
Yeah, I want to ask you later about some of the stuff that didn't make it into the book, but it stuck with me what you just said about most of these displaced U.S. Americans not considering themselves climate refugees. Did you get the sense that people were overlooking how climate change can drive migration in a prosperous country like the U.S.? After all, people might be more familiar with how climate drives migration to the U.S. when citizens of Central American countries are displaced by flooding, droughts, hurricanes.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I think there's both parts of the term climate migrant. A lot of people that I spoke to would have taken issue with or just didn't really apply to themselves, right? So for the one thing, a lot of people I spoke with didn't necessarily believe in the science of climate change or didn't necessarily think it was the reason why they had been displaced from their homes. And a lot of times they could point to other factors in the built environment or other reasons why, they shouldn't have been living where they were. And then migrant as well, though. I mean, like I said at the start, people would leave behind places that they called home, and they would end up making semi-permanent to permanent movements elsewhere. But because they oftentimes felt stronger connections to the place they'd left behind, and because the process of relocation was so messy and took them a while to come to grips with what was happening, they also didn't really think of themselves as migrants, right? Because it wasn't really a matter of the psychological decision taken to leave behind one place in favor of another. It was like a prolonged struggle, mostly against economic reality, that led them, eventually sort of get budged, sort of shoved somewhere else. So yeah, I mean, they all are, in some sense of the word, climate migrants. But most people don't think about it that way.
Let's dive into chapter 1. You have so many memorable characters in this book. One of my favorites is this guy, Patrick Garvey, a Canadian man who ends up growing exotic fruits in the low-lying Florida Keys. What happens to Patrick Garvey?
So Patrick, he spent years reviving this nursery, this tropical fruit nursery that had been sort of left to die by an old hermit on this island called Big Pine Key. This was really a place where like misfits of all kinds could come. It was relatively cheap. Most people lived in trailers or underneath elevated homes. It was relatively affordable, even though the Keys had gotten quite expensive. And after Hurricane Irma hit the Keys, it was a high Category 4 hurricane with winds in excess of 150 miles per hour. It obliterated that island. And in the aftermath of the disaster itself, not only was the fruit grove destroyed, but because of FEMA regulations, Patrick wasn't technically allowed to rebuild on that property. So after years of kind of like basically struggling to find a permanent home, he ended up back there eventually on a new trailer that was slightly different. But it took him years to recover. I mean, his family left him. His wife and kids ended up leaving the Keys because it was just too awful there. His friends a lot of times left. And he kind of went through like a dark night of the soul. This person who had been like a pillar of that community, with a really truly like a public resource in that nursery, just struggled along for years. And even when I spoke with him 4 or 5 years after the disaster, he wasn't quite sure that he was going to be able to stay. He was just kind of coming to grips with the fact that like there was always the possibility of another storm. Sea level rise is advancing quite quickly there. It's unclear whether the grove might be subject to inundation from subterranean penetration of groundwater. He was really, really unsure, and it really unmoored him. And that, I thought, was really powerful, that a person, this was the only place that he had ever really belonged. I think that's what he felt, had been, while never actually leaving the island, he had been completely, knocked out of his life. And all the things that he had found that kind of solved the problems of his life were then taken from him. And it didn't seem like it was possible to recover. That was like the reality, which is a really difficult one to face, I think.
Yeah, it was certainly a poignant story. And I liked in your response, I mean, I think it's in the introduction to the book, you split up the different drivers of climate migration. There's the one we maybe all think about, like the severe acute weather disasters, but also government policy, like you mentioned, buyouts in flood-prone areas of North Carolina, the private housing market insurance policy, like after the fires in California, and then this sort of slow motion, long-term displacement as we see in Arizona and Virginia with flooding, erosion, and water scarcity. Let's maybe go north a few states and use a term that makes people angry, managed retreat. Before I read the book, I had heard of the managed retreat away from Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, which I think is the first instance of an entire community receiving federal tax dollars to move away from an area threatened by climate change. But I didn't know the story of Lincoln City, a mostly Black community that thrived in eastern North Carolina until 1999. So how was Lincoln City threatened by climate change, and how did the government respond there?
Yeah, so Lincoln City was built on really, really flood-prone land. It was land that the white planters in Kinston, North Carolina, after the Civil War, they just did not want to develop on it because it was too prone to flooding. But a group of descendants of formerly enslaved people did found a town there. And in the 90s, after 2 successive hurricanes in 4 years, the federal government decided to give some money for basically the first iteration of the buyout program that I described in Houston. They gave the county money to, instead of they thought, okay, we don't have enough, the homes in this neighborhood aren't worth enough for us to build a flood wall or build a dam or something, or elevate them. Elevating the homes would cost more than each home was worth, was the conclusion. So they said, well, our only option is to knock all the homes down and give people money to go somewhere else. And this is a program that was really designed for use in agricultural communities along the Mississippi River, places where there was not too much housing density, and there was not too many people in general. And this was the first time, or one of the first times, it had been deployed for an urban community, certainly, or on the scale that it was deployed, about 1,000 people. And this was a devastating event. It was far more devastating than the hurricanes for the people who lived in this community. They were all sort of scattered to the wind. Most of them ended up in foreclosure in their new homes because the money that was given out was not sufficient to handle the payments on a more expensive home. And I think people to this day, 20, 25 years later, still discuss this as a racialized crime by this white government to basically dissolve a neighborhood where people felt, really, really secure. It was the only neighborhood of its kind in that city. And the government just didn't see fit to protect it. That was the perception. And they just bought everyone out, and, most of them ended up far worse off. So this is managed retreat, right, is in some ways productive term that people, I think, need to think about, because we've built in a lot of places where we shouldn't have, right on the beachfronts in North Carolina or Florida, and then in the deep fire prone hills of California. I think it's productive and necessary for us to think about, well, how do we stop just rebuilding in these places over and over and over again? But what I kind of came away with from this chapter in Lincoln City was that in the few places where we've tried this, it doesn't work. It leads to a lot of pain. So this thing that's the most cost-effective tool for responding to climate change, just get people out of the way, it has a lot of deep and troublesome implications. And that's what I was kind of trying to get at in that chapter.
No, I think it really worked. And as you say, not everyone likes the idea of resettling, and the government has to balance its objectives of giving everyone the freedom to live where they want and protecting them from climate impacts. And I think in the Louisiana chapter, it really came through to the reader that it's not just, walls and ceilings that are under threat from climate change, but also culture and history. Can you tell us about the Pointe-aux-Chien tribe and how climate change is shaping where they can live?
Yeah, so this is a tribe close to the Ile-de-Jean-Charles tribe that was participated in this federal resettlement program. This is a tribe. It was for hundreds of years. It was completely subsistent, right? I mean, they could fish for shrimp and oysters. They could grow vegetables on these bayous in coastal Louisiana. They could raise cattle. The land was solid enough. And as time went on, the oil industry kind of came in and sliced up the bayou. Erosion started to advance much quicker. And over time, the tribe had to sort of gradually relocate up and up and up and up and up, farther away from land that was disappearing. And a lot of the things that made the tribe self-sufficient became impossible. The cows couldn't walk around anymore because it was too wet. The salinity of the water changed, and it became impossible to raise oysters. And so over time, a lot of the things that made this community what it was have become more and more difficult and more expensive to do. So a lot of people who were subsistence fishermen, for instance, have started to work on tugboats that tug benzene up and down the river, or oil products. And so I think, most people from the tribe have basically stayed within the same general area, although many of them have had to move away from the very edge of the water. But even as they kind of just make this slow, voluntary retreat inland, they've lost a lot of the cohesion, I think, that made them, an entirely, self-sufficient tribe for a long, long time. That's a very painful process for people to come to grips with, because it's not even always clear while it's happening, what's happening.
It was certainly painful, and you again described the difficulties of the choices facing governments. I mean, you talk about how the county decides to shut down the school, right? It's the heart of this community, but where the kids learn about indigenous and tribal culture, and it seems like a heartless decision. But then the school is destroyed in Hurricane Ida just a few years after the closure, and so in some ways you see that it's a sensible decision. So it's definitely tough choices there. Can maybe go back to Houston that Sarah talked about a little bit. I was also moved by the story of Adelina and Brigido Gomez, who don't speak much English, and they move into this Houston neighborhood that's a major flood risk without knowing it. And the realtor wasn't obligated to disclose the flood risk because state law doesn't require you to do that the same way you have to disclose asbestos or lead paint or something like that. In your reporting, did you come across other stories of people moving into climate vulnerable areas without knowing it?
Oh yeah, plenty of people. I mean, I would say probably the majority of people who end up in a FEMA mapped flood zone or in what's called the wildland urban interface in California, which is the part that's really prone to wildfires. If they do understand that there's vulnerability at some basic level, they don't understand the degree of the vulnerability, or I think the scale of potential damage, right? So, I mean, Houston remains kind of the best example where people just didn't understand how water moved through the city, and how even if you channelize a river and dig a trench for it that's very deep, there's always the possibility that will overflow. And if you build a levee, yay high, the water can always go yay plus 1 inch, right? But I mean, yeah, I think that there's just a lack of awareness in general in the housing market, most of the country, of the potential risks. This is the case in the West too. I mean, I think most people who move to a place like Las Vegas or St. George, Utah, or Phoenix don't have a very sophisticated understanding of how water supply in those places work, and nor should they, because PhDs on the subject don't always understand it. So it's kind of understandable that they wouldn't. But yeah, I mean, people just don't really realize what could happen, and there's not a lot of attempts made by certainly the real estate industry, but also the government, to educate them, because nobody wants to say, don't come here. That's not something that we've ever said in this country. And local governments and companies and boosters, people who currently live in places, mostly want growth. And with growth comes increased housing values. And with more housing value comes prosperity. And so it's not an easy proposition for people to say, don't come here, it's too risky, or let's get out of here. Nobody has any incentive to do that. And that's why I think you have this sort of general deficit of awareness of the details of the risk.
Yeah, totally. Some people have a vested interest in not recognizing climate risk, or at least publicizing it. You do have this subchapter called bailouts in your book, and in the context of what happened last week with the sort of bank runs and bank collapses in the U.S., I've also been thinking about unrealized losses. And actually, right after I read your book, I saw this study in Nature by Guverich et al. Who found that U.S. Residential properties exposed to flood risk are overvalued by $120 billion or more. And so there is that problem of unrealized losses in connection to climate change and housing as well. You sort of brought up in your last answer an interesting stat from your book that in general, so this is a book about people often fleeing climate impacts, but in general, people are still flocking to the hottest and driest parts of the country, like Miami, Dallas, Phoenix. Does that surprise you? And how could drought slow the expansion of a city like Phoenix?
No, I don't think it surprises me. I mean, I think that, it takes a long time for people's awareness of a problem like this to go beyond, okay, maybe there's one hurricane and that would be really bad, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's chronic. I think people have trouble with chronic risks like sea level rise, aridification in the West, and it's just there's the whole thing is just chugging. So it's going so well right now, the growth of the Sun Belt, that it's just hard to imagine that it could stop. But I think that there's serious signs. I mean, certainly not in Florida. That shows no signs of abating. But in the West, I think that there's serious signs that local and state governments are getting really uncomfortable with the amount that they've overdrafted most groundwater aquifers in the area. And certainly, communities that are dependent on the Colorado River are starting to realize that there's, significant risk that they get their amount that they can get from the river just completely curtailed by the government in the next few years. And it would take a while for this to sort of digest through the housing market and through the real estate industry. But I mean, I can tell you from reporting at Grist that the builders and developers in Phoenix area are seriously worried about this. And they're starting to say things like, why don't we just take our capital and move it somewhere else if the state's going to give us so much trouble going to try to stop us from developing at every turn out of these water concerns, right? So there's an existential risk for the growth of that area. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to lose water who currently have it, but certainly, as the government takes a look at the data about what water is available, they're going to make some seriously difficult decisions, and those are going to have ramifications for the growth of that area and others like it.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you that the Sun Belt will keep growing. And before we really restrict housing in the Sun Belt, I think we might have people paying more attention to the trade-offs between water and food and energy resources. I mean, if the water starts to dry up, people might ask more questions about how their neighbors are using it. And we know that about half the water in the Colorado River Basin is used for crops that humans don't even eat directly, like hay and
Yeah,
alfalfa, beef.
alpha.
It's
Yeah,
using all of our water. And as you see, if you can't have a lawn or a fountain, and maybe the new semiconductor factory can't open, then you might ask more questions about how the way we use water for agriculture and things like that, or to grow corn that we turn into ethanol. There are maybe other ways to save water before restricting housing in a country that needs more of it.
certainly. Yeah,
yeah,
but then you have to get it from the agricultural users, and that is far easier said than done. And in most cases, they have superior senior rights to the water from a legal perspective, and even when they don't, they tend to be really upset about the idea that they would give it up. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, there's a lot of water that's used for alfalfa. Most of it goes to much of it goes to Saudi Arabia, but that doesn't mean that we can just move it all. I mean, you can, but it's difficult.
Yeah, no, I liked your reporting in Grist on the Saudi dairy farm that's using up most of the water, or a lot of the water in Arizona. I want to ask you about the possibility of a backlash to some of the internally displaced people. I mean, is that a possibility? That's something we've seen previously in American history, like after the Dust Bowl, when people fled from the Southern Plains states to California, where they faced discrimination and were called Okies. Do you think we could see a backlash to some internally displaced climate migrants here?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think that there's mercifully been few such episodes in the last few decades, but it's not difficult to imagine that. Well, actually, I mean, I think probably the best example is that after Hurricane Katrina, many people from New Orleans went to Houston, and they found later that if they called about a job application and the employer saw 504 as the area code, they were not getting a call back. There was some serious backlash to the people who really had nowhere else to go, and they went to the nearest cheap city where there's possibility of staying for money that they could afford. They faced serious backlash. I mean, after Hurricane Maria, the diaspora from Puerto Rico was extensive. People ended up in Buffalo. People ended up in Springfield, Massachusetts. Actually, every state ended up seeing someone or a few people resettle permanently after Maria. And in those places too, they faced some serious challenges accessing social services. Many of them don't speak English, so they don't speak English super well. So yeah, there's totally possibility of conflict there. And I think that a lot of cities, like in the Rust Belt, for instance, Cincinnati, have styled themselves as like climate havens. Buffalo has said this too. Well, come here, it's relatively safe.
You talk about climate-proof Duluth.
Yeah, Duluth. Yeah, yes. Harvard professor Jesse Keenan came up with this proposal. Well, why not go to Duluth? I think a lot of people, yeah, it's because it's cold. But even once you do that, there doesn't guarantee that everybody there is going to love the fact that housing gets more expensive, that there's a new cultural influence. Perhaps there's a ton of potential for conflict there. I think we've been blessed that we haven't seen a ton of truly to say nothing of violent, but really sustained and vile backlash. I think that's been relatively limited, but at least for domestic migration. But there's no question that that's a possibility. I would say even a likelihood as the decades go on.
Yeah, it brings us back to the terms we use. I mean, displacement instead of migration, or I think you use the gentrification towards the end of the book as well. Something you said earlier was how many things your editor had to cut. I mean, you tell so many good stories in fewer than 300 pages. Is there something that got cut from the book that you'd like to share? Maybe something you wish you could have gone deeper into?
Yeah, I think that it's not so much that it got cut. It's just that I never ended up going all the way on it. But so in the 1980s, I believe, the United States conducted nuclear tests on the Marshall Islands, and they gave everyone in the Marshall Islands the basically unlimited right to move to the United States. If you were a citizen, if you're Marshallese, you could come here without having to go through the whole asylum immigration process. And a bunch of them did, and many of them came to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where they settled in a community. There's like a big poultry industry there, and there's a pretty robust Marshallese community in Pine Bluff, Arkansas now. And then decades later, this rule is still in effect. And now that sea level rise has become quite a bit of a problem for the Marshall Islands. Another sort of wave of people have come from the Marshall Islands to Pine Bluff, and that community has grown more robust. I mean, it's far from without challenges. By many people there really don't have a lot of money, but I thought it was a really interesting example of how when you take away the strictures of international migration, when you give people the ability to move where they will, you see really surprising and at times generative trends. People tend to move where they can have some kind of community cohesion, and it's a big part of the identity of that city now. It's probably one of the largest Marshallese diasporas in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And I thought that was fascinating, both as a potential indicator of where we might be headed as time goes on, and also as an example of I think we often think about international migration we often think about international climate migration and counterfactual, well, it won't happen because we won't let them in. And this is an example of if people have the ability to migrate to the United States, they can often have a really, they can effectively set up really robust and unique communities. I think that was really encouraging for me, actually, in a way to think about.
Yeah, we're getting into international climate migration now, and we're starting to see a few questions come in from the audience. But you talking about the Marshall Islands made me think of the rules or the lack of legal categories that we have to talk about people displaced by climate change. I mean, there's no clear definition of climate migrants in international law, and they're not covered by the 1951 Refugee Convention, which extends protection to people who fear persecution because of race, politics, religion. And when you're talking about the Marshall Islands, I was thinking about this 2016 lawsuit brought by a man from Kiribati. And he got deported from New Zealand, and he sued before the UN Human Rights Court, saying that the deportation was unlawful. And the court basically said, this deportation was actually fine, but a state could be in breach of its human rights obligations if it returns someone to a country where, due to the climate crisis, their life is at risk. And that's the case for these really low-lying islands. I don't know, is in the last chapter, you get a little bit into maybe policy responses or how to deal with some of the international climate migrants coming to the U.S. Is there anything you'd like to say on that about policy responses or migration to the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are not really trying at all and may not be trying for a while. And I think that there's a serious sense in which, in order to fix the problem of domestic and international climate migration, you have to fix the problem of housing provision and housing affordability in the U.S. generally, first of all, which we haven't really tried to do. And you also have to fix the problem of the immigration and asylum systems, which we're also not really trying to do. And that being said, there's pretty easy levers you can pull to make this stuff a lot easier, right? Like, for instance, the Section 8 housing voucher program is currently funded by Congress at a quarter of the entitlement, right? So 1 out of every 4 people who are eligible for the program can actually get a voucher. That's why there's lotteries in almost every major city. And then, for instance, something like temporary protected status, right? Like after, disasters in Haiti, for instance, we've given temporary waiver of immigration restrictions to people from that country. This has never been used explicitly as a result of climate change, but it could be, right? This broad executive authority to deal with displacement crises that way. So it's like, there's just none of it is easy to do, but it's not as though we're really trying that hard. We're kind of in kindergarten on it, it feels like. And it's like, there's a lot of policy weapons that the federal government, certainly Congress, but also the executive branch has to deal with this problem that we haven't really tried to use yet.
Yeah, here's an audience follow-up question on policymaking, asking which conversations are not happening that need to be happening, or where are the blind spots greatest? I like what you were saying about providing more housing, fixing all of these. Is there one big blind spot that you thought that jumped out to you from your reporting?
That's a really good question. I think in general, the probably the biggest blind spot is the extent to which the federal government right now spends the vast majority of money that it spends on disaster relief is spent on basically just rebuilding things more or less precisely the way that they were, right? So we just put the buildings back up, you fix the streets, the local government gets reimbursed. And what we don't really do is spend money. This is changing to a certain extent, but not enough. We don't really spend money on preparing for disasters. We don't really spend money on making communities more resilient to disasters before they happen, right? So there's this statistic that's pretty frequently discussed is for every $1 you spend on what's called resilience, preparing for climate disasters, you usually spend $6 of post-disaster recovery spending. So it's much more cost effective to, for instance, put a living shoreline along the water or elevate some homes than it is to just rebuild them over and over again. And while Congress has allowed FEMA to spend a small proportion of its annual budget on such things, there's a huge need there that is not being addressed.
Yeah, and the politics of climate adaptation are pretty invidious. I mean, the question of who gets protected by the government and who doesn't. You talk about the federal government spending $150 million in Norfolk on the Ohio Creek watershed project, but to buy some time, you elevate some areas, improve drains and wells. But people outside of that project are faced with this debate whether to raise their home and don't get protected. Another audience question is from Natalia Burgos, and she's asking, how do you connect the topics of climate justice and human rights?
Yes, I mean, I think that I sort of go into this at the end of the book, but I think that if you want to find a solution to the problems, to the stories that I was kind of laying out in the book, it really starts with thinking about what rights do people have and what rights do we think that they should have, right? And I think that like an exemplary one in this respect is like the right to shelter, the right to housing. And in order to fully fulfill that, right, not only do you have to make sure that people can afford housing currently in the US, which they can't, right? And the government, compared to 80 years ago, does much less than it once did to make sure that that's the case. Then you also have to make sure that people from other countries can get to a place where there's safe, affordable and secure housing, right? And we also don't really do that. And so I think that as you look at the full scope of the problem of climate change and you look at the way that it impacts people, what you often see is that there's, yes, a lot of death, but also a lot of displacement, economic loss, financial loss. And I think when you try to figure out how to redress that, you end up saying, well, it should be the responsibility of the wealthiest countries and the biggest historical emitters to ensure that people who are displaced by this problem have the ability to secure their human rights, right? Like the right to shelter, the right to a stable life, the right to certainly to food, water, etc. But especially, a home, right? An ability to stay in a home and not have to fear being pushed out of it all the time. So yeah, I think those two topics are intimately connected. And you really can't talk about climate justice without talking about like the rights that people have to a good life, which we don't really, they're sort of unrealized rights right now.
Another question from an audience member asking if you have an idea of how many Americans could be forced to relocate because of climate change, and where are they likely to go beyond climate-proof Duluth?
I don't want to say no, but it's really difficult. It's really, really difficult to assess the potential scale of this. I mean, right now, probably, I think last year about 3 million people were displaced from their homes for any length of time, even if it was just a day, by climate disasters. And, some small portion, probably 10%, maybe 5%, we don't really know, didn't end up making it back to those original homes, right? So you take a couple, 10,000, 100,000 people a year, and you multiply it out over years, you're getting into the tens of millions by the middle or the end of the century. But that's a number with a high degree of uncertainty. We really can't predict how many hurricanes there would be in a given year. We really don't know where they're going to hit and how vulnerable those places are to displacement. So it's a big, big question mark. But it seems like the answer is a lot. And what we do know about where those people tend to go sort of suggests, though again, there's a lot of uncertainty, that they will move from rural areas to cities, and they will move probably not immediately. They won't really move over very long distances. They'll tend to stay within the same general area to the extent that they can, right? So perhaps someone from Miami would move to Orlando, perhaps someone from Houston might move to Dallas, things of that nature. And then only in the, second half of the century, I think the experts think that we would actually see a coordinated or, really large scale movement away from the riskiest regions of the country. And that would probably be caused, I think, by like really significant increase in extreme heat events, right? Where it's just, you're basically guaranteed to encounter that kind of heat every summer. You're going to start rethinking where you live, as opposed to thinking, okay, well, maybe there's a 1 in X chance that a hurricane hits my house. So yeah, it's really hard to know when that would happen, but it seems like mathematically, unless warming is drastically slowed, you're going to see some kind of reevaluation of the future of the right now the hottest, so to speak, housing markets in Florida and the Sun Belt, but it's a ways off.
Yeah, estimating the numbers is really hard. There's so many different levels of uncertainty. Like you have to figure out to what extent climate change maybe made a hurricane worse, and then is everyone who leaves Honduras or Florida after a hurricane a climate migrant? There's multiple things to figure out before you can put a number on it.
Exactly.
Jerry Mikowski's asking which organizations are doing the best work on this topic. Maybe there's some sources or some databases that you found most useful.
So, yeah, I want to highlight one that it's specific to the United States, but I thought was like doing really incredible work, and it's this organization called Resilience Force. It was started by this guy named Saket Soni, and basically what his organization does, after a disaster, there's a really, really large pool of mostly migrant workers that show up in places where a lot of housing has been destroyed, basically set to work, building things back, right? Just clearing debris, helping people rebuild homes. And these laborers are vulnerable, really, really vulnerable to labor exploitation and to human rights abuses. And basically what Saket's organization does is they sort of organize and advocate for the really sort of not transient necessarily in terms of they don't have somewhere to live, but they're itinerant workforces that show up in these places and are, key to getting people back on their feet, but are, often really, really underpaid and exploited. And that I thought was a really, really really sharp and essential way of tackling this problem. But just when you have so much catastrophe and chaos, there's always so much opportunism. And while, individual NGOs don't have the money to protect a city like Miami or something, that's really the federal government's job, I think, and the job of the U.S. Congress. They can help protect, the most vulnerable subpopulations like the workforce. I thought that was a good one. Resilience Force.
Resilience Force. Just to repeat that, we've just got time for one or two more audience questions. We've got one from a YouTube watcher asking, do you believe the USA as a leader of the free world should take a more active role in responding to the impact of climate change? And how realistic is this given competing policy priorities between Republicans and Democrats? So maybe you can say a word on what's currently happening in DC with regard to responding to climate migrants, or maybe what the Biden administration has done so far.
Yeah. I mean, the United States should be the leading, as the largest historical emitter, should be the leading voice on climate, reparations and on the addressing what's called loss and damage at the UN conferences, right? Just the total financial loss and devastation that will be caused around the world by climate change. Right now, the U.S. negotiators tend to be the main obstacle to those negotiations at the UN conferences. And I think we're a long way off from, as a wealthy country, reckoning with the, downstream damage of fossil fuel emissions that we've caused. However, I think 4 years ago, even at the November 8th, 2020, I think I would have been really, really skeptical that something even as basic as the Inflation Reduction Act with subsidies for green energy could have been passed. So I think that, while there's a lot of work to do, I don't want to say the logjam has broken because, Kevin McCarthy's the Speaker of the House. He doesn't have much interest in this kind of stuff. But there's certainly a sense in which the public awareness and the amount of priority that policymakers have devoted to this is so much more ubiquitous and profound than it used to be. Even 5 or 6 years ago, I think that nobody really would have seen things happening this way. So at least certainly I didn't. So there's that. Every now and then you can get a window and do something, but yeah, the U.S. has a huge moral and political onus on it to deal with this, and we aren't at the international level. We're just not.
Well, yeah, some positive signs towards the end of our discussion. The Biden administration did put out the 2021 report on the links between climate change and migration. Got time for one final question from Mateja Mirkusic. You mentioned that many people don't want to move from their homes. What do you think about the right to stay, and do you think that the federal government should support that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, 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 really difficult question, right? Because I think that the history of the use of eminent domain in the United States is really, really nasty. And that's the main, short of offering somebody money, which is voluntary, that's the main way that, the US can affect the involuntary displacement of people from these places, right? And it's hard for me to say that because first of all, it's extremely expensive. It's very difficult to put into practice. And also it has a dark side, right? So it's hard for me to say that, we shouldn't let people stay where they are. But I think that if you're not going to do that, you have to really, really make it really easy and really financially viable for people to leave. And some of them won't. But then you have to intervene once that person who's in that house passes away or dies. Then you have to have a way of getting in there and saying, well, you know, the government would like to come in and buy this home, please. We don't want you to sell it to somebody else who could then. So there's got to be ways to interrupt that cycle. But I think that, you know, if people really, really want to stay and they have the option to leave and they'd be fairly compensated and they still don't want to go, it's hard for me to say that the government should make them leave. It's just a tough call, and I think it's one that, you know, a lot of local governments will find themselves having to make. But it leads to a lot of pain really fast. And
you tell this story in your book of these people living in these neighborhoods in Houston where you can't build new homes anymore, and half the people have taken buyouts and are gone, and the other half of people kind of like being in the half-empty neighborhoods where all the houses around them are just empty lawns maintained by the government.
Yeah.
Maybe
people
in some cases for justice, maybe you have to wait for people to pass on and slowly turn over the neighborhood. But I see we're out of time, so I'm gonna just recommend Jake's book one more time. Here's a copy from the Carnegie Library. Jake, thanks so much for joining us today. Sarah, you as well. And thanks so much to the audience for spending their time with us. We will see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.